Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I would like to introduce Elder Whiskey Jack, Elder Francis Whiskey Jack, to start us before we get started with some opening words and an opening prayer.
I'll just ask all of you to join me at this time with your wonderful spirits that we've been given, your physical presence today, and the acknowledgement of life, the gift of life, your mindset, and the life path that we choose, and the memories that we have, and the learning that we have, and also our emotions in the times that we're happy and in celebration of ceremony, but also in the times that we grieve. And we all hold this in sacred balance as we do that circle walk, and we recognize how we connect with the Creator, first of all, Mamu Tawi Mau, Father of all, and how we connect with the universe, and how we connect with our Mother, the Earth, that has allowed us so many gifts, and the animals that make up our food chain and our nourishment so that we're alive. The bird kingdom, the plant kingdom, and everything that is alive, including the water beings. So today, my name is Fine Day, ceremonial name. I'm from Saddle Lake. I'm a Cree. So I say this prayer for all of you. I ask the Creator to grant us mercy. Tapoya nuts nanaskumon kap minamoya wa sound wa patama minuta miugis gaganuts umuta mina soita kiheo Watson Eagle's Nest minumuta mama upon kawi pik squatama homa kagi pex namakus segoge kagi wanita tsikup matsun wa omitet magamina anots tuskaimna nakmamote se hawasasak minuguta uskaya kuksnamaksa kahkioga matoskawayagik kiame gapatote kaptaguta makigwe magamionote mione hektautsu mioteheon sagituen atamskutatuun wakutuen isma nagatamagoya koge numuson pannanak nokum pannanak soimnannuskagissagak yaksaman snanaskamun mine mamsi totawako atayokanak ogisagwak ismama tausik tawitamgoyak mindupanamagoyak umamomusigaon hi kakionagumakanak all my relations.
Thank you, Francis. I'm going to introduce Amber Dion, who is with the School of Social Work, but I just wanted to start by, I wanted to acknowledge Roxanne. And I needed to do this today because I know that, one of the teachings that she was very firm with me when we started working together in 2017 was that we are ensuring that we are creating this space to open in this way. Because when we do this and we invite our elders and our knowledge keepers to start us with prayer, it guides us, and it guides us in the most meaningful way, in the most thoughtful way, in the most loving way. And so I'm so thankful that Francis is able to do that for us, because that's definitely something that that Roxanne taught all of us, is ensuring that ceremony is very much a part of our journey. So thank you, Francis. pass it on to you, Amber. Amber is an assistant professor with the School of Social Work. She's also the co-host with me on Two Crees and Pod. And she's just going to go into the brief history of Orange Shirt Day. So I'll pass it on to you, Amber.
Tanse, good morning. If my Wi-Fi is choppy, I apologize. If I freeze, please let me know. But good morning, everybody. And thank you for having me here. So Tanse, I bigasis ni tigas and ginagomase kotinia. My name is Amber Dion, and I'm from the Kihiwin Cree Nation here in Treaty 6 territory. And yes, I am an assistant professor with MacEwan University School of Social Work, and Terri's partner in crime on Two Crees and a Pod, amongst many other things. And so thank you for having me here. I'm really looking forward to our conversations today. I'm really looking forward to engaging with all of my colleagues from across MacEwan. I'll share just a bit about the history of Orange Shirt Day. We can't assume that everyone knows about the history of Orange Shirt Day. And so, back in like 1973, a young Indigenous girl was sent to a residential school in British Columbia, and her name is Phyllis Webstad, and she was wearing a brand new orange shirt. And she was excited about wearing this orange shirt to school. And her shirt was taken from her, and she was put into the residential school gear that all children were forced to wear. And so on September 30th, ever since 2013, we have been honoring Phyllis's story and the stories of all residential school survivors with wearing orange shirts on September 30th. And so again, this has been in existence since 2013. We have a number of community-led grassroots events that have been taking place since 2013 for Indian residential school awareness and for the honoring of all the students who survived Indian residential schools and also those who didn't make it home. And I think my colleague Shelby is going to speak to some of the new findings of children's bodies at residential school sites. And so I won't talk too much about that. So it's really important, I think, for us to think about how things have kind of changed over the years. So 2013 Orange Shirt Day. And just this year in 2021, our federal government has announced that September 30th will now be federally recognized as the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And this is due to one of the calls of action in the TRC calls to action that was released in June of 2015. And it's specifically in relation to Call 80. And so when you look at the calls to action, Call 80 really speaks to it states that the federal government will work with Indigenous peoples to establish a statutory day to honor survivors, their families and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process. So again, that is in regards to Call 80 of the TRC released the calls to action in June of 2015. It's a public document that anyone and everyone can access. It is one of the first things that I introduce my students to in my Indigenous knowledge course. What I really respect about the work that the TRC did for many years is that when they developed the calls to action and released it, you will see in the calls to action that there's pieces that relate to justice, to education, to social work, to healthcare, to all levels of government. And so we can very easily go through the calls of action and look at our specific discipline of practice. We can look at how the calls to action really do call on us as educators, as staff, as an institution to ensure that we are honoring the rights of Indigenous folks. Another really important document that I have my students look over is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which has been endorsed by Canada as of 2017. And it is an incredible document that we can look at that really just speaks to the basic human rights of Indigenous folks worldwide. So one of the other things I really would like to mention is that institution-wide, there are some simple yet profound things that we can do. And one of those things is to wear orange shirts. You know, it is something that, again, is quite simple, but also quite profound. When we see the flood of orange throughout our institution, it really makes a statement to all of us. You know, to Indigenous folks specifically, it's really a very visible act of solidarity and allyship that I think is something that we always really love and appreciate, is when we have folks in solidarity with us. And again, I think that there is some responsibility that we carry as an institution. As you know, MacEwan University is located on Treaty 6 territory. And so we have a duty and a responsibility as an institution to ensure that we are, you know, again, following those calls to action and honoring that. The other piece that is also really important is that, you know, one of the things I've recognized over my years in academia is that sometimes we want to rush towards reconciliation, and you know, and I understand why we might want to do that. And one of the things is that it feels good to be in active reconciliation. It makes us feel better, and that it really helps us to kind of push down some of the other things that might be coming up for us. I encourage all folks not to rush towards reconciliation, and to remember that truth and reconciliation go hand in hand and they coexist. There is still lots of truth telling and truth sharing that needs to happen and that will continue to happen. Is that I would offer is that we still have a lot of truth telling to share, and that creating space for truth telling and reconciliation, again, to be in relationship with one another is really, really important throughout our institution, especially in our classrooms. The last thing I'll say is that there's an article, an incredible article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it was written by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. And so if folks are interested in reading this incredible article, please do. I'm going to read one short piece of this article that really speaks to the differences between decolonization and reconciliation. And so it says, reconciliation is about rescuing settler normalcy, about rescuing a settler future. Reconciliation is concerned with questions of what will decolonization look like. Decolonization is not accountable to settlers or the future of settlers. Decolonization is accountable to Indigenous sovereignty and the future of Indigenous peoples. And so I offer you that to think about in relation to, you know, again, looking at, looking at truth and reconciliation, but also really looking at the decolonization of our syllabi, the decolonization of our classrooms, the decolonization of our assignments, the decolonization of how we teach our teaching philosophies, incorporating decolonization strategies within your teaching philosophies, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's far beyond reconciliation and truth. And that's not to minimize truth telling and reconciliation processes. It's also really to ensure that we are talking about decolonization, because in my understanding of reconciliation, reconciliation is more about decolonization and ensuring Indigenous sovereignty and ensuring Indigenous visibility and ensuring Indigenous narratives and rhetoric and scholars and students, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's bigger. And so I invite you all to conciliation and also decolonization processes. And so I'll stop there, and then I'll pass it off, I think, to my colleague Shelby. And then I'm open for questions or comments or anything like that.
So, so we'll invite Shelby to unmute, and just Shelby is new to MacEwan. I met Shelby years ago when she was working at the government, but I've also met you through Roxanne. And through being in community and being in ceremony, Roxanne was very close to Shelby as well. Shelby is working with the Faculty of Fine Arts and Communication in a one-year term as an Indigenous Assistant Professor. And so we've invited her to share with all of you some resources that may be available to faculty and staff.
Good morning, bonjour, Tanisha, Tanse. My name is Shelby LaFramboise, Oceania, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I live my life as a Métis, as a Métis Esqueo, and I'm really honored to be here taking part in this dialogue with one another for the Greater MacEwan faculty and staff. Thank you, Terri, for the gracious introduction, and again, acknowledging Roxanne. And I would like to say that she was instrumental in a door opening me here, as well as you and, you know, the many great people who have kind of been my ally in the greater spaces of this place called Amiskwachi, Waskaigunik, that I call my home territories now, where I work and play. I'd also like to thank Amber for her beautiful encapsulation, and she covered quite a bit there in her brief time, but essentially a beautiful way of kind of covering the incredible meaning behind the orange shirt and Phyllis's story, which is really in all of our stories and all of our families. We have all been impacted by the legacy, incredible dark legacy of Indian residential school experience, but also for settler nations as well. And we've all been impacted by this experience, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. And it is an intersection of how we live our daily life with one another. And sometimes we are unaware of our conscious or our unconscious bias and how we occupy our greater spaces. And this is all the way from how policy was formed to how we indirectly or sometimes unfamiliar of how policy still has lasting scars and marks on us and how we intersect with one another. So I know that Amber spoke much about kind of, you know, the history, and, you know, we have those long lasting effects and, you know, affects daily. And we see that through, unfortunately, finding, you know, 215, finding our babies, but we all carry those stories within our families. These stories are not new. These have all been silenced within our familial generations. Sometimes our families are, you know, have spoken about them, or they've been captured through the experience through the TRC, how those have been kind of protected. And we're seeing it through the day school experience. We're seeing it through the 60 scoop experience, and how that kind of generational legacy has impacted us. But essentially, it's all through story. And so when I think about how, you know, these stories are now coming to truth, to what we now call Canada, to our greater territories, and Canada is really kind of uncovering this incredible genocide, cultural genocide, linguistic genocide. It's impacted every part of our physicality, our spirituality, our emotional being, and our well-being. And, you know, how do we kind of tell a new story? Amber also spoke about the idea of reconciliation. For me, as an Indigenous woman, reconciliation is really a subjective experience. I cannot tell anyone what reconciliation looks like to them. I cannot even fathom or uncover, you know, the essence of how that feels internally or looks physically. I think it's a subjective internal experience. And if people are willing to share that process, then I think that's a beautiful way. But sometimes it's within oneself, and people do that gracefully with dignity. And sometimes we see the legacy, and we see that legacy through trauma. And trauma is really something that we, as Indigenous people, are still intersecting with daily. And I've provided a resource sheet, and I believe it will be shared in the chat or shared at another time. And I just kind of drafted it last night. I thought really valuable links that would be helpful to you as faculty and staff. There is a beautiful highlighted story of a woman from, I believe, BC territory, and she speaks about her life. She speaks about, you know, the trauma within her family and how she had fractured her children because she was carrying this, but she had kind of come through 5 generations, and she speaks about how it's necessary for 5 generations of people. And she references her grandchildren and how her grandchildren will never know the impacts of this legacy within these little tiny awasis, these children. And so I think it's a beautiful story that maybe you might even share within your spaces as faculty with your students, because it shows kind of the full circle. It's about a 5-minute video that you can kind of take up as well. I'd also like to preface it that when you are going through these links, these resources, to be careful and to take wellness as self-care when you're going through this information, because it can trigger something within all of us. And so really taking that time to kind of meditate, really taking that time to kind of process what you're navigating. And I think about within my own family, understanding that the 215 was a trigger within our family. And every site, whether you're Inuit, whether you're First Nations, whether you're Métis, we all have those stories within our families. And we all know that the ground penetrating radar has been taking place for a very, very long time. And prior to kind of this public knowledge, it would have been through industry. And industry would have known of our children and where they are resting. And so again, I was referencing that this is nothing new, but how do we take, you know, these really fracturing stories, and how do we make new stories? And I think it's spaces within our scholarly realms, like MacEwan, spaces within faculty, how you facilitate knowledge, spaces with our students and how they can create new stories with one another. And again, talking about the idea of reconciliation, but more so the idea of ethical spaces. And how do we lift up ethical spaces within the place we call classroom, whether that be land, this digital forum, and how do we do that? So that is just a quick snippet of you know, the idea of the Indian residential school experience, the significance of the orange shirt, and how we're taking up cultural ways, cultural practices, language, story, music, and how this incredibly traumatic and long-lasting effects and affects on our communities, but how do we tell this new story? And David Heath Justice, he's an American scholar, Indigenous scholar, and he talks about the idea of we have been hearing so much of the dark story for so long. It's necessary. And he references that we are more than trauma porn, It's incredibly strong language. It's incredibly strong language, but we are so much more. We are so much more. Our stories matter, and there is beauty in our stories. There's the happy story, the everyday lived story through ceremony, through going to school, through walks, through with a relationship with our children. So I think my challenge is to consider the transition of this. It's heavy, it's complex, it's traumatic. How do we do that with self-care? How do we do that with dignity and grace? But also, how do we tell new stories? And so MacEwan collectively, we will be looking at ways to support the Indigenous residential school experience for a course that will be designed here, and collectively we will be lifting that up, but also a First Peoples course with FFAC, and how that will look in the future, time will tell, and that will be lifted up collectively as well. So looking at ways that we can meet the needs of MacEwan students, staff, and faculty. So hi Marcy and Oscarman for your time, and I open up questions and dialogue. And I think sometimes that's a wonderful way for us to learn and walk together.
Thank you, Shelby. So we do have a couple questions, and I will go into the first one, and whoever chooses to want to answer that. Should we not be talking about indigenizing the system within the university as opposed to decolonizing? You can't truly decolonize a colonial system such as a formal Western university, but you can certainly bring Indigenous ways of knowing into the university and make something new and better.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the share. I think that's a beautiful way. Indigenizing is a process. It's also, I think you're referencing methodology. And I was just referencing, or was just having a meeting prior to, and again, understanding, looking at, there's some systems, there's lots of, like methods, and ceremony, I think, is a beautiful way of looking at methodology as well. Looking down south in Lethbridge, looking at, Maslow, and looking at Blackfoot hierarchy of learning, looking at different ways that we're creating space within our classrooms. So yeah, I completely agree with this statement. So thank you for sharing.
That has been my question to every Indigenous scholar that I know. I have posed that question. How do we truly decolonize one of the oldest colonial structures in this place that we call Canada, which is Western academia and Western education? And so it is a fantastic question to ask. I think that I would say that if we talk about indigenizing the academy, that's where some of the metaphors can come in. And that simply adding, an Indigenous guest lecturer to your class, hey, great, do it, please do. Please invite Indigenous folks into your spaces to do that. I think that it is important, though, that we do consistently ask ourselves, how do I decolonize my classrooms? How do I ensure that even in my space, in just my classroom space, how do I ensure that, that I am providing a decolonized methodology in my readings, in my assignments, and so looking at oral transmission, looking at, oral storytelling, and looking at, some of the pieces of knowledge that don't necessarily have the rigor that Western academia supports. And so having things like podcasts and elder stories as part of scholarly work in your classroom is part of, in my opinion, a decolonizing process. No, we can't fully decolonize a Western institution. we would have to quote unquote burn it to the ground. I'm suggesting anything burning. I am just saying that that is something that we would have to consider. And so it's really important for us to think about, again, the differences between reconciliation and decolonization, and that we absolutely can be part of a decolonized process. But again, that begins here with us and ourselves first, and then we transmit that and transform it into our classroom spaces or into our family life as well. It's a great question. I ask it all the time.
Thank you, Amber and Shelby. And I know as Amber had shared, that definitely that's a question that I've had with many of our Indigenous community leaders and educators and scholars, is in regards to where is that fine line? Where is that fine line between how Indigenous can I make MacEwan at the end of the day? And it's not even about that. It's about what space and what responsibility do I have here to ensure that we are providing opportunities of education, that we are ensuring that we are creating safe spaces for Indigenous students, staff, and faculty, that free from racism and discrimination. How am I ensuring that they have opportunities to ceremony, to smudging, to elders such as Francis? There's so many different moving parts to that. And again, there's always this very fine line to having those conversations around indigenizing and decolonizing. And I think they both work hand in hand in a sense of taking a bit of this and taking a bit of that and rolling with it. So thank you for that question, Travis. The next question that I have here is, I am a clinical nurse educator in the Faculty of Nursing. My clinical students have a day of assigned clinical hours at a healthcare facility on the 30th of September. Recognizing the power differential between myself and my students, knowing many would not likely feel comfortable asking for the day away from the institution to spend some time in their home communities with their family or attending events, I intend to have the day earmarked for student participation in events and ceremony, and will provide them to links to the events through MacEwan, encourage them to attend any events in their own community or that they are also aware of. What do you think about MacEwan not institutionally allocating the day as non-instructional? I'm going to start on that one. And then if anybody wants to jump in, one of the things that this crept up on us quite quickly in regards to the day being recognized as a national holiday. And one of the things that I've always done is gone to sit with my own mentors, with my own communities and other leaders, presidents of other Indigenous institutions, and ask the question. Because I think that one of the biggest things is that we want to ensure that we are doing things in a respectful way. And it could come off as disrespectful if we are open. But one of the conversations that came from that dialogue was, what is our responsibility? This is a day of National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And we know that education is a really big part of educating Indigenous and non-Indigenous people about the history in this country. And oftentimes, if we are closed for that day, there isn't an opportunity to talk about it. It's in my eyes, and other people feel this way as well. It's an easy way out. And I was reading a blog last night in regards to a non-Indigenous psychologist who was talking about how disrespectful it is that institutions and schools are staying open on the 30th. And I disagree. Like, I didn't respond, but I completely disagreed with the post, because I think first, as a non-Indigenous person, you are making it your own in the sense of stating what you feel may be disrespectful. And I think at the end of the day, what is all of our responsibility here at MacEwan, and not just sitting with Kehoe Whetstone, but within each of our faculties, and how are we ensuring that we are doing something that day that we are creating that symbolism as Amber had talked about. We ordered 1,000 orange hearts, which will be in this week, that we are dispersing out across campus. And so if you are interested, you could reach out to kw@mcewen.ca. We have some volunteers who will be assisting with us to getting those hearts out. They are vinyl, there's some that are stickers, so they could go anywhere. But I think ensuring that we are showing that we are doing something that day, which there is a number of things that are not just happening that day, but are happening over the next year. Because for us, it's not just about doing something on the 30th. It's ensuring that we are creating space to educate and hold ceremony for our students and for our staff and our faculty and our community. And this was a conversation, I think that, you know, I believe that we should be open on that day. And maybe it isn't an instructional day, that maybe there isn't classes that day, but we are hosting events and we are coming together and we are learning in different spaces about what really is the true history from Indigenous people of this country. And so next week on September 23rd, we have Dr. Lillian Gadawa-Cryer, who is going to be offering a webinar on the legacy of Indian residential schools. And that will be a 1-hour session from 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock on the 23rd. I'll have Crystal put the link into the chat so people are aware of registering for that. As well, as I mentioned, we do have the Orange Hearts that will be coming in on Friday. And so if there is interest from different departments who are interested in those, please connect with us at kw@mcewen.ca. The shirts are selling out, I heard, at the bookstore. We have a number of people calling, trying to get these orange shirts from McEwen. I just got a call from Victoria School of Arts wanting to purchase shirts, and I know that we may not be able to handle that capacity. Any kind of orange shirt is fine. You know, if you have an orange Oilers shirt, wear your orange Oilers shirt. Definitely, just again, the showing your support in some way is definitely something that we want to create. Shelby mentioned something, and I think in regards to the 215 and the initial shock of the graves that were found in Kamloops at the site of the old Indian residential school. And I just want to inform people that, you know, we're over 6,000 now. And I think that like the media has kind of tapered off on sharing that information, but as more old sites are being examined, there's obviously more graves. And so I believe we were over 6,000 a couple weeks ago across Canada. And so, you know, one of the things that we want to make sure that in our MOU that we have with Blue Quills University is to ensure that we support that process in some way as well. And when they do their ground penetrating radar search, which will be likely next year or this year, I'm not sure yet, they haven't said that, but I'm going to move into the next question because we do have another question. I want to make sure that we are able to get to everybody. Did anybody want to respond to that question as well? You're good? Okay. The next question, how should we conduct our classes on September 30th? For those of us who will be there in person, are there resources we can use to that we can use to start off the classroom?
I did share like a one pager, and it was just essentially some links that I thought were really useful and helpful. You can even just create like, you know, you could start with a smudge. You could, if you don't have someone to lead your smudge, you could even just start with a circle and to acknowledge and to just remember, to take the time to remember this lasting, you know, the impacts of the Indian residential school experience on all of us. and to create some space and some dialogue. You could also open with, one of the links that I provided. You could even just ask people how this matters to them and how this impacts their daily walk. It doesn't have to be exhausted, but I think creating space and creating dialogue for students is a beautiful way. Again, acknowledging wellness, self-care. We're not asking people to go into heaviness here, but sometimes people do need it. And I'm not trying to give, Elder Francis Whiskey Jack an incredible workload, but, if it's not on that particular day, maybe it's another day. Maybe it's another day throughout the term where you could create some space and some dialogue for a guest speaker or dialogue, or, Elder Francis Whiskey Jack to come in and kind of open with a prayer and to just create some dialogue on how this has impacted us as all people here, as all nations, whether we be Indigenous nations and settler nations together, and how this has impacted us and the policy. So I think if you can even create, there's also the 48 books, pieces of literature, which are a fantastic way. Read a piece of literature, even have your students read one book together. Maybe every student reads a chapter. There's a beautiful short novel, it's called Fatty Legs, and I used it with my master's thesis. It's a seminal text now. And I was interested in how Canadian teachers were teaching about the Indian residential school experience. So it's a very short text. And if someone is still intersecting with this knowledge, it gives a Northern perspective, a Northern story. And I was able to meet her. And unfortunately, she has, gone on to the spirit world. But I think about beautiful ways that you can have dialogue with your students. It can be creative, and it can be, from just a simple safe space to have dialogue with one another, or a video, a blog, a chat. So that's my information there.
Thank you, Shelby. I'm not sure if you have anything to add, Amber. I just wanted to make mention that on that day as well, on the 30th, we will be having a sacred fire. So we have a fire pit just outside of Keoweston. And so we will be having a sacred fire ceremony that will be happening all day. And so we have a firekeeper that will be watching that fire, but it's an opportunity for people just to come together in that space outdoors. We will also have elders available in the center and resources available. We will be creating opportunities for circles as well. Circles, and if anybody needs any resources on circle facilitation, definitely reach out to us too. We have some documents and some resources on that. But I think sometimes just creating that opportunity to sit with your classes and say, hey, or even prior to that, assign one of the podcasts. Like our last podcast that Amber and I did was with a lawyer, a Métis Cree lawyer who she worked on residential school cases for a number of years, and talks a bit about that. Or even our very first podcast was with Dr. Leona Makokis, and it was at Blue Quills University. And so she talks about the history of blue quills. It's our most listened to podcast, but giving that as an opportunity before the 30th for them to listen to that, and then coming together in circle and reflecting on what did they take away from that. And again, it's just creating those opportunities for a discussion. Amber, did you want to add anything? No? Okay. What about you, Francis? Yes.
I want to say thank you all for such good comments and the history. In our holistic walk, I'll say, remember that we're working with a lot of sister agencies that will also be involving their, PowerPoints, education of the Orange Shirt Day. And as Shelby mentioned, we are not only in this city, but provincially and throughout Canada, recognizing this day. And I know that as a residential school survivor, it's our job as elders, that I'm one of the lucky ones to be still alive, and to also again say what Terri has said so importantly, that our link to this healing process has a lot to do with that ceremony that we practice, indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous ways of doing. And this is one that is really one that involves commitment. And I like to role model a healthy lifestyle. And that was acquired through a lot of trauma, that the truth always comes from lived experiences. And I realized that a lot of our colleagues maybe not have experienced residential school, but when you experience the trauma, all of a sudden you see things in a different light. And again, it's not to blame, but to create that healthy awareness that this still affects our youth today and our families. You just have to go downtown and look and see some of the effects that are still pretty traumatic, So I just wanted to kind of mention that. And one of the greatest things that ever was given to us by our elders and our grandfathers was ceremony, and to acknowledge this gift of life every single day with the symbolic cleansing and our connection to one another as human beings. And it sits good with me. And a lot of times when I see our young people that have been influenced by the addictions, it's very hard to process. And it kind of is a constant battle to build that self-esteem, self-pride, language, everything that you mentioned. So I just wanted to make that final comment, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Francis. So the next question that we have, thank you, Francis, Terri, Amber, and Shelby. Would you please share the meaning and significance of solidarity and allyship for you? I'm a settler scholar and I teach a seminar called Gender, Crime, and Social Justice, where we study criminalization of women and mothers. I welcome your suggestions for fostering inclusive, ethical, and brave spaces for learning and reconciliation, and for revealing beautiful stories. Does anyone want to take that question?
I can, and then I can definitely ask my colleagues here if they have things that they want to add. I think that one of the things that I share often with folks around me is that there's some real, sometimes I cut out. Sometimes there's a pause in my Wi-Fi, but there's some differences between allyship and performative allyship. And so it's really important for us to ask ourselves, where are our acts coming from? Is who is being served by our allyship? Are we being served? Are we serving ourselves through our allyship, in the form of social capital, to gain social capital, to gain financial capital? And so the question that I often ask myself as an ally, to who is my allyship serving? Is it self-serving? Is it serving to the community? And so I often ask myself that question. Again, is it to gain social capital or other forms of capital as well? It's a really important question to ask ourselves. I think that one of the differences between allyship and solidarity, actually, wait, I'll say one more thing about allyship. You know that you are an ally to Indigenous people when they call you called deadly, by an Indigenous person. If they say, man, that Francis is deadly, then you know you're an ally. And it takes years to become an ally, and the community will identify you as such. I think that one important thing about solidarity is that it really means getting in the gutter with folks. It really means getting in the literal gutter with folks. And so that could mean I have tons of ally folks who have been my ally across this institution, have stuck their necks out for me and for our Indigenous students. And so solidarity looks like sticking your neck out and taking some pretty brave risks in the classrooms and with your colleagues and with leadership. And so there are many ways that you can perform allyship that serves only us. It serves self. And so again, I think the question to constantly ask yourself is, who is my allyship serving? And if it's not serving the community in which I claim to be an ally, then it's performative. And then again, solidarity is about getting right in the gutters with us, literally getting in the gutters and sticking your neck out for folks, marginalized folks. So that would be my answer. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in.
Thank you. Thank you, Amber. So we have a couple more questions and we have about 10 more minutes. So I'm gonna just move through the questions if you guys are okay with that. Can you speak to ways we can talk about decolonization when we experience resistance? For example, how to address microaggressions towards Indigenous folks?
I'll speak about it briefly. I think if you're talking about microaggressions, micro or macro, then you're probably looking at something deeper that is systemic. And I remember here we were facilitating blanket exercises. I think this would have been post TRC time. And I remember listening to one ally, incredible ally, who an administrator had asked, what happens when you have educators who don't believe that First Nations, Métis, Inuit context should be in curriculum? And this incredible ally, who is non-Indigenous, by the way, had shared that then you really have to question if you have the right staff in place. And that is a strong, strong, strong statement. But I think we have made tracks since the TRC. It's my hope that we've made some tracks in addressing the calls to action. They say that we've only actually addressed upwards of 14 across Canada at this point, but I guess that's an ongoing research. But if we're looking at microaggressions, then we probably need to look at some of leadership within the spaces and how do we create healthy work environments. And it comes from within, but it also comes from looking at our structures that are in place. And these are probably deeper systemic issues that are, I hope that we're transcending, but we know that they are present. And this is something that we will continue to encounter on the daily walk of the spaces we occupy. I'm not sure if Amber or Elder Francis would like to chime in as well.
For sure. I'm going to say one quick thing. If we are experiencing resistance, good. That means that we're talking about it. That means that we're bringing it up. That means that we are engaging in conversations where it's being brought up. And so I invite you to embrace the resistance and embrace it in a way that you are going to need great stamina. You are going to need incredible stamina. And Indigenous folks know this well. And so I think that, if we are experiencing resistance, when we bring up Indigenous anything and everything, that means that things are bubbling up for folks, things are coming up and we're unsettling classrooms. We're unsettling meeting spaces. We are unsettling everywhere we go. And so we are absolutely going to experience resistance when we are in the process of unsettle the spaces. And I wish you all the stamina in the world to continue to embrace that resistance. And you have folks at KW, and you have hopefully folks in your own lives that you can reach out to and say, man, this is tough. I am experiencing all these microaggressions. I'm experiencing this resistance. You know, what can I do? And oftentimes it's to talk to one of your folks, your supportive folks, because microaggressions and resistance are inevitable when we unsettle spaces. And so my encouragement to you is to keep unsettling. And again, wishing you all the best in your stamina in your workspaces for doing that. So thank you.
Thank you, Amber.
I'm
Yeah, go ahead.
going to use this analogy of building bridges. When you build that structure, as you say, build it with the proper kind of materials, and even the weather elements will not, you know, if the bridge is not built properly, it's going to fall. Mm-hmm. And this bridge that I'm talking about is creating those relationships. And you will know who your supporters are. And it's a lifetime journey. That's just the reality of it. And I've seen that through my lifespan. And I just keep trucking away. What the heck? So I would say that.
Thank you, Francis.
Thank you.
And I'll just add a comment as somebody who experiences microaggressions in my work, in the community. And I think that one of the things, and you know, through stories of sharing experiences with other Indigenous people, is that oftentimes when it happens, we don't say anything at that time. And you know, I've tried to, you know, I can be a very vocal person, like in sharing how I feel comfortably. But when I've had comments that have been disrespectful, that have hurt me, or have been, and sometimes they're not even, the person saying them doesn't even know that they are being disrespectful in a sense. It silences me, and I don't respond, and I don't say anything. And I think that one of the biggest things is that, you know, as an ally or people who are in those spaces is to check in on other Indigenous people when there is things, you know. There's oftentimes like, and it's constant, you know, across this campus from, you know, the first week I started at McEwen up until, you know, this week, where we've experienced people making comments about pronunciations, people making comments about let's have a powwow, you know, that are non-Indigenous. And again, like, there may be no disrespect intended to that, but it's, again, is checking in and ensure that we are educating one another and supporting one another in those spaces is really important. Check in on your Indigenous people. Literally check in with them in your classroom, in your workspaces, for sure. We have 2 minutes, and so I'm just going to go into one more question. And it is, Shelby, can you expand on the reference to what's going on in Lethbridge for those of us who might be unfamiliar like myself?
Oh, sure. So what I was referencing was really Blackfoot wisdom and how that was used to inspire Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you can just type that in there and you can find a whole bunch of Indigenous scholars who have worked in that depth and breadth. And really, it will, if you are just intersecting with that for the first time, it will clearly disrupt your idea on Maslow and how he was actually researching the Blackfoot people, and the idea of self-actualization is a Blackfoot concept, which is inherently in an Indigenous way for most of our nations. And so I think if you can just search that up and you can find that.
And we actually, Shelby, we did have that presentation offered at McEwen quite a few years ago. And so it was recorded with Ryan, who teaches down in Lethbridge and came up to Edmonton to do this session with our campus. And so we can also look back and dig up that video as a resource to that teaching that day. And so thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, if there is any additional questions or resources required, you can email us at kw@mcewen.ca. We are hosting another seminar to speak to the legacy of Indian residential schools with Dr. Lillian Gadawa-Cryer on the 23rd. There is a number of events happening, and it's really tough in terms of how we are communicating them out. And so definitely, if there's some interest, connect with us. We will be sharing as we go the events. On the 29th, we are live streaming an evening of music and healing. It's in partnership with the University of Alberta, and we have a number of Indigenous artists coming together to share their gift of voice and music. And so all different kinds of music will be shared that evening. And there is tickets available for those that went live yesterday on our Facebook page. So with that, again, thank you everybody for joining us, and ensure that you stay connected with Kiel Weston. Bye.